Everybody knows we're more divided than ever. The one thing everyone agrees on is we have never been so divided. But I disagree. Division and conflict are embedded in our foundation. The Declaration of Independence and Constitution are products of division. We celebrate compromise, but you don't need to compromise if you aren't first divided. We've seen how much uproar there was over the Constitution. The only thing everyone agreed on was that George Washington must be the first president. But while everyone revered Washington, the person whom Washington trusted most, Alexander Hamilton, could not have been more divisive. Hamilton, the illegitimate son of sketchy characters in the Caribbean islands, was a genius who immigrated and served as Washington's chief aide during the war. Of course, he was one of the most important writers of the Federalist Papers, and Washington named him his first Secretary of the Treasury. But many people hated Hamilton and his vision for the country. The policies Hamilton introduced as Treasury Secretary were hugely successful in some ways, and at the same time, they almost tore the country apart. In simple terms, Hamilton and the Federalists wanted a strong central government and military, and an economy favoring manufacturing and trade. Hamilton's Federalists had no sentimentality for the common man or democracy. Common people needed leadership from their superiors, that's it. The first thing Hamilton did to strengthen the national government and economy was to recommend the central government assume all the state debts from the war. States had issued all sorts of bonds and IOUs, and it didn't seem like they would pay them off if they could. The result would be bad credit for the country, and without credit, they had no chance. So Hamilton insists that the federal government assume all the state debts, take them on, and fully fund them in full, or pay them off with interest. Hamilton, however, did not want to be debt-free. No, he wanted to issue new bonds and maintain a permanent national debt. The idea is if you manage the debt, you'll have powerful people literally invested in the long-term success of the national government. And that was crucial at the time. No one knew in 1789 if this thing was going to work at all. But this can only work if you have cash to pay off what you owe. So where's that money going to come from? Hamilton proposed three main sources of revenue. One, a tariff, a tax on imports that would bring in money and keep down competition for manufacturers in the U.S. Two, excise taxes on specific goods, most notably a 25% tax on whiskey, which Western farmers basically used as cash. And finally, three, the national bank. And remember, a bank is not just a place to store cash, it is a business or a corporation through which people pool their money and lend it out in order to make more money. In a simple sense, a bank rents money to borrowers. Hamilton's Bank of the United States would combine public funds with the fortunes of private citizens. Private citizens who would be running the bank. Hamilton's policies showed real signs of success. U.S. Treasury bonds received high credit ratings in Europe and money was rolling in. But they also sparked violent protest and inspired organized political parties, something all the founders dreaded like the plague. Thomas Jefferson, who insisted the government could not create a bank unless the Constitution specifically allowed it, and thought debt would be poisonous to the Republic. He became the de facto head of Hamilton's opposition. Farmers disapproved of tariffs that raised prices on manufactured products and joined other Hamilton opponents in Democratic Republican clubs, the first significant examples of organized parties in the country. The most alarming protest came against the whiskey tax in western Pennsylvania, where farmers tarred and feathered tax collectors and threatened to revolt against the U.S. government. Only Washington himself, leading an army in their direction, convinced them to give up. The Whiskey Rebellion echoed the Stamp Act protest, and to many it was the same fight, except now the U.S. government, not the king or parliament, was trampling their rights. According to historian Gordon Wood, for the Democratic Republicans who rallied around Jefferson, Hamilton's system threatened to recreate the kind of government and society that many Americans thought they had destroyed in 1776. Assuming the state debts, adopting excise taxes, establishing a standing army, and creating a national bank seemed to be reminiscent of what ministers had done in England. In the eyes of the Republicans, it was the struggle against the corrupt monarchism of the 1760s and 1770s all over again. Now folks, Americans did not live in a vacuum, and just when they needed it least, here comes the French Revolution to poke the hornet's nest. In short, the French Revolution began in 1789, the same year the American government began. Unlike the American Revolution, a war for independence, This was a radical uprising against the monarchy that turned into a bloodbath. The French revolutionaries used the national razor to lop off the heads of elites by the thousands, beheaded the king and queen, and then turned on each other. Remember, France had been our most important ally against Britain. Without French help, there would be no United States. And many Americans supported the French revolutionaries, especially the Democratic Republicans and Thomas Jefferson. But as it grew more extreme, the Federalists in the Washington-Hamilton camp were appalled. The revolution created real problems in America, especially when France declared war against England. The US needs to trade with both, but by doing so, they risk making enemies of one or both. The young United States was not equipped to wage war against anyone at that time. Both the French and English navies confiscated American merchant ships. And then the new French ambassador, Citizen Genet, rolled up in Charleston, encouraging Americans to attack British ships. He went all over the states challenging President Washington, who wanted to maintain neutrality, and he started inflaming the Republican clubs and whiskey rebels. To pacify the British in 1795, Washington sent John Jay to negotiate in London, and the resulting Jay Treaty gave all sorts of trade privileges to Britain. Now, Jefferson and the Republicans claimed it was a sellout to the British and a betrayal of our French allies. New York mobs burned a copy of the treaty on John Jay's front door. In Philadelphia, Blair McClanahan announced, "What a damn treaty. I make a motion that every good citizen kick this damn treaty to hell." When Washington announced his retirement in 1796, the Federalist program lost its biggest selling point. John Adams won the presidency narrowly, but he had nowhere near the respect of Washington. And when he takes over, France, angry over the Jay Treaty, was attacking American ships all over the Caribbean islands. This was the beginning of the so-called quasi-war, which just means it's a sort of war, not declared or total, but still basically war. Instead of declaring total war with France, Adams sends 3 ambassadors to France to work out a solution. But the French ambassador insists they pay a bribe before the government will meet with them. The ambassadors and President Adams absolutely refuse. And when news of this hits America, the ambassadors were referred to anonymously as Misters X, Y, and Z. And the so-called XYZ affair sparked outrage. Even Jeffersonian Republicans who hated John Adams and loved the French now rallied around Adams as the defender of American honor. So Adams had this glorious moment and the opportunity to capitalize on all his support. But what does he do? He completely ruins it. Adams thought he could use all this momentum over the XYZ affair to crush the Jeffersonian Republicans for good. He convinced Congress to pass laws known as the Alien and Sedition Acts, which make it more difficult for immigrants to become citizens and criminalizes speech or writing that was critical of the government. These were simply meant to make it harder for French people to become citizens and gain a voice in the government, and to shut up his critics. Several notable newspaper editors, even one Federalist, were thrown in jail. The Alien and Sedition Acts were some of the most blatant violations of the First Amendment rights of free speech and the press. And the Federalist Party died because of them. But 2 of Adams' chief opponents, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, responded in a way that would have dramatic, unforeseen consequences. Jefferson and Madison each wrote responses to the Alien and Sedition Acts that they issued to the public anonymously through the state assemblies of Virginia and Kentucky. In these, quote, Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, they argued the Union was a compact between states and that states could decide if federal laws were unconstitutional. They insisted states could declare federal laws void and without force. In Jefferson's language, it alarmed even Madison when he said, quote, unless arrested at the threshold, the Alien and Sedition Acts would necessarily drive states to rebellion and blood. Jefferson isn't calling for peaceful protests, he's talking bloody rebellion. And at the time he wrote this, he was the vice president of the United States. As for Madison, he was the most essential crafter of the Constitution, declaring the federal government would have ultimate power over the states. But now he's suggesting states can veto federal laws and implying they can break from the Union if they feel it necessary. After all this squabbling between Hamilton's Federalists and Jefferson's Republicans, after all the bitterness over the French Revolution, here in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions was the foundation stone upon which secession and civil war would rise. Because for decades after, slaveholders cited Jefferson and Madison to protest anti-slavery efforts and finally to legitimize secession. Even in the 1950s, not 1850s, 1950s, several southern states cited the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions in a lawsuit to prevent school desegregation. So I hope you are seeing how everything in history just keeps building on that which preceded it. Nothing happens without long-term, unforeseen consequences, and we are still living in the wake of actions taken centuries ago. I also hope you see that division and conflict are nothing new, but have been fundamental to the American story from day one. Division, you might say, is as American as apple pie. Or maybe apple pie is as American as division. We'll see you next time.